I'm going to say, tell me what you want, what you really want. You're going to say, justice. And I'll say, tell me what you need, what you really need, justice. Tell me what you want, what you really want, justice. Tell me what you need, what you really need, justice. How are we going to get it? People power. How are we going to get it? People power. How are we going to get it? People power. How are we going to get it? People power. All right, let's try it out. Tell me what you want, what you really want. Justice. Tell me what you need, what you really need. Justice. Tell me what you want, what you really want. Justice. Tell me what you need, what you really need. Justice. How are we gonna get it? People power. 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 So the task force really works hard. Good job. In conjunction with a lot of these communities that take to the streets, that work to educate, that work to provide relief to the Philippines when disaster strikes, and in advocacy. So we participate in ending, in combating these three things, militarism, racism, and materialism, in multiple ways. We have multiple methods of doing these things. But I did want to talk about how the Philippines is connected to racism. I had some very disturbing, I'm going to call them editorial cartoons from around the time the U.S. was trying to justify coming into the Philippines. And some of the images are quite shocking. But for some of you who don't know, the Philippines was colonized by Spain. Magellan was actually made his trip to the Philippines and was met there by resistance and killed by the indigenous people in the Philippines. That place wasn't known as the Philippines yet. After that, about 300 years later, Spain was losing its grip on its empire because of the resistance movements of both Cuba and the Philippines. Spain was finding it really hard to maintain its power, being that there was so much resistance and revolting continuously. So when Spain as an empire was starting to collapse, it decided to save face along with the United States by selling some of its colonies to the United States. And so the United States took on this responsibility as a colonizer of the Philippines. William H. Taft has referred to Filipinos as little brown brothers. An interview with a visiting church delegation published in 1903, President William McKinley, a Methodist who many Methodists are proud of, defending his decision to support the annexation of the Philippines in the wake of U.S. war in that country. So, William McKinley says, "When I realized that the Philippines had dropped onto our laps, I confess I did not know what to do with them. And one night, late, it came to me this way, that we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. That we could not turn them over to France and Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. And that we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government. And they would soon have anarchy and misrule over their worse than Spain's wars. And that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died." Who has been to a Methodist church older than 1899? Yeah. All right, who's been to a Methodist church older than 1904? All right, it's interesting when I walk into these churches, and when I walk into these churches, I'm like, man, by the time these churches were built, Spain was still ruling, was still colonizing the Philippines. Spain still had its presence there, and it was transitioning from Spanish rule to being ruled under the U.S. So this racism continues, this feeling that the Filipinos cannot govern themselves, that'll just end up in anarchy. In 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair happened. In 1904, the U.S. spent $1.5 million to bring 1,300 indigenous Filipinos to the World's Fair, to put them on display, like part of a zoo. 1905, Truman Hunt brought Filipinos to Coney Island and amusement parks to entertain. And these indigenous folks from the Philippines were paid $15 a month to participate in Coney Island and amusement parks. And they were paid to do mock tribal ceremonies and to eat dogs. They were paid this to show how unfit Filipinos were for self-governance. This was all propaganda justified by both Christianity and by both the money that we paid in order to perpetuate these stereotypes. So, for those of you who don't know the Philippines, it sits on the Pacific Rim, which is a very volcanic area. And so the Philippines is very rich in minerals, very rich in resources, and yet the people are poor. There's a saying in the Philippines that if you spit out a seed into the soil there, the next day it will grow to a tree. It's so fertile there. The land is very rich. Can I get the next slide? So the Philippines is also a strategic location in economics. During the Spanish trade and before that, it was a sweet location for trade routes, right? You hit Asia, the Philippines had access to every part of Asia, and it's also known as the gateway to Asia, actually. So not only is it strategic economically, it's also strategic militarily. Next slide, please. And then the Philippines is divided into 3 regions: Luzon, the island on top; Visayas, the islands in the middle; Mindanao, the southern islands. The southern islands, Mindanao, is where there's a heavy population of Muslim people. They were never truly conquered by Spain. So this cartoon, you can't see it very well, but in the middle is a queen representing Spain, and she's trying to hold on these 2 children. The one on the left, the child that's illustrated in black, has a label that says Philippines. And then the child on the right, who looks more Latino, the label on him says Cuba. So this is Spain trying to control their children. Next slide. This is Uncle Sam. Now that the Philippines has fallen into our lap, what do? The child in the illustration, it says labeled with the Philippines. So you can see how racism is totally tied into the U.S. coming into the Philippines. Next. This is another illustration of the Philippines being portrayed as characters in Uncle Tom's Cabin as Topsy. Next. And then this is President McKinley giving the Filipinos their first bath. Next. This is Uncle Sam with shears that say education and civilization, giving haircuts and, civilizing, quote unquote, other folks that have countries that are labeled by them. And the Filipino is next up to be civilized and educated. Next slide. And then we also see Islamophobia is part of this too. So Uncle Sam is spanking somebody who has labeled Filipino on them, and then across the island it says Moro, which is what Filipinos call the Muslim population, Moros. Next. So this is the ticket, the flyer from the World's Fair in St. Louis that I mentioned, where Filipinos were put on display. Next. This was a Muslim family that was put on display as well there too. Next. And then this was Filipinos in Coney Island amusement park. Next. So as far as all of that propaganda was put out, there was very racist propaganda out there to justify the colonization of the Philippines. Next, we have militarism. As I mentioned, the Philippines is a strategic location for military. Every president in the U.S. has said this. President Trump has repeated this. The Philippines is a strategic location. This is a picture showing the military bases, military personnel that are present in the Philippines right now. Oh no, in 2011. And this has only increased over the years. So the Philippines is affected by U.S. militarism through the location, through the establishment of U.S. bases, through U.S. military personnel, through counterinsurgency programs, which result in not only countering terrorists, so-called terrorists, but also ends up targeting activists, human rights defenders, including students, clergy, women, peasants, and the poor. This is why we use the term extrajudicial killings. These are killings that happen outside of trial, outside of judicial process, for the sake of following a counterinsurgency operation. We also receive weapons from Israel. And Canada was about to give helicopters to the Philippines as well, but there was so much public outcry that they hesitated on that. So, next. We're going to talk about materialism. So because it sits on the Pacific Rim, it is a rich country, but the people are poor. So there's the extraction of minerals and resources. There are many ores that can be found in the Philippines, and the extraction of minerals and resources results in the pollution of the waters, in the killing of the local bioecology, and also in the illness of the indigenous people that still live in those areas. Next slide. This is me at an open pit mine, not being very happy because the area used to be very green and mountainous, like in the mountains you see in the back, but now you have rocks from mining companies just like tearing up the area, flattening the area, and now the stuff is higher than me. I'm not very tall, but it was a huge sight to see. You can see it from Google Maps, this open pit mine in the Philippines. And a lot of this raw material ends up in a lot of our electronics and a lot of the materials that we use every day. And then, next. Then we have Filipinos who are leaving because the government has an export policy where 6,000 Filipinos leave every day to find work because there is no work in the Philippines. So they leave to other countries as domestic workers. There's also, before, a brain drain, what they call a brain drain, where health workers were leaving, professors were leaving, scientists were leaving the Philippines with the lack of resources, the lack of people to be able to provide that kind of care in the Philippines. And so you have push and pull factors happening with migration, and this is exactly related to militarism. Not only is there extraction of minerals and resources, there is extraction of people. People are being used as commodities, seen as commodities. Next slide. When these OFWs, the overseas Filipino workers, they leave, they send money back to the Philippines. And in 2017, they sent back $33 billion US. And this is what keeps the Philippine economy afloat. So all of this extraction, this taking, is taking a toll on Philippine society, splitting up families and making it hard to live. Next slide. This is Flor Contemplacion. She's a migrant worker who was killed. She wasn't given fair trial and she was blamed for a murder. And she wasn't able to really have a proper lawyer and all that kind of stuff, and she was executed. Next slide. This is Mary Jane Veloso, also a migrant worker who was fooled into drug trafficking by an agent that recruited her into doing work, and she's now on death row in Indonesia. Next slide. This is her family trying to help free Mary Jane Veloso. Next slide. And I know I painted a very picture of the Philippines, just showing you the problems. But the thing is, when I take these trips, what I'm always impressed by is the resilience of the people and the resistance of the people. Even though all of these conditions exist, we still remain Asia's longest running people's resistance, going 50 years strong. Despite the heavy militarization, despite the decades, the generations of oppression, there are still people who are standing up in mass, and not only that, the movement continues to grow because of solidarity allies like us, and because of the work that's happening in the Philippines. As we as a task force continue on in this work, we've had some victories. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Urban Shield, that program that trains police based in Oakland. As the task force, we stood in solidarity with the Stop Urban Shield Coalition, and we were able to stop Urban Shield for 2019. Our task force has joined together in freeing political prisoners. Our task force has helped to halt the execution of Mary Jane Veloso. Our task force does life-saving work. Our annual conference does life-saving work, and it's about time we all know this and celebrate it. So I hope that this time together can be one where we continue to be inspired and continue to be motivated, especially in times that seem really bleak. Amen.